Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for coming back. I hope everybody had a great day at the sessions today. I'm Dennis Montoya. I'm a Diversity Advisory Committee member, as well as a former Keystone Fellow. It's my great honor to introduce both the Andy Robertson Memorial Lecture, as well as its 2019 honoree. Not only do I get to talk about two great leaders in diversity, but specifically two leaders who have impacted me on a personal level. First, Andy Robertson, for whom this lecture memorializes, was Keystone Symposia's Chief Scientific Officer from 2005 to 2011. He is remembered not only for his well-known passion for science, but for his genuine concern for his colleagues and his sensitive and insightful commitment to social justice. During his tenure, he developed innovative meeting programs to bridge academic and industrial research, which he affectionately called nerd camps. He built the foundation for Keystone Symposia's Diversity in the Life Sciences program and co-founded the Keystone Fellows Program. Dr. Robertson unexpectedly passed away in 2014, but his influence lives on. His Fellows Program had a unique top-down approach, focusing on minority scientists who are in the process of obtaining or transitioning into their first faculty position. Recent studies have shown that the biggest leak in the diversity pipeline is at this transition to the faculty. Underrepresented minority PhDs have disproportionately low application rates to faculty application, despite increasing numbers of PhD scientists of color. The Fellows Program provides mentoring support to help us effectively progress to independence and maintain the desire and the hope of securing a faculty position in today's competitive funding environment. Only senior scientists like yourselves have the experience to effectively mentor scientists at this critical juncture. I am a beneficiary of Dr. Robertson's legacy. The collegiality and respect that I've witnessed at the SAB has inspired me to persevere in academia. Because of the Fellows Program, I have the honor of calling Dr. Jeffrey Ginsberg and Irene Ricks my mentors. The support seems to be working. I recently had my first on-campus interview for assistant professor of quantitative biology at UC Davis a couple weeks ago. Fingers crossed. This lectureship is also a legacy of Andy Robertson. Established in 2015, it honors an individual with a long career of excellence in diversity and mentoring in the biomedical sciences. This lectureship goes to Dr. John Matsui, co-founder and director of the nationally renowned Biology Scholars Program, or BSP, at the University of California, Berkeley. Over the past 27 years, over 3,000 undergraduates have graduated from this program, and Dr. John Matsui himself has personally mentored over 1,000 of them. Yes, over 1,000, just by himself. And there has been notable successes in this program. For example, African American and Hispanic students in BSP graduated with a degree at the same percentage as Asian and white students, a rate which is more than double the graduation rate of minority students who are not in BSP. Underrepresented students in this program were more than twice as likely to graduate with a 3.0 or greater GPA as compared to non-BSP students from disadvantaged backgrounds. He's also made impacts in the medical community as well, with 85% of his BSP grads admitted to medical school. In fact, of those who applied, 85% were admitted. In fact, between 2006 and 2009, 10% of all the African Americans enrolled in a California medical program came from BSP. But Dr. Matsui didn't just stop there. He has disseminated his BSP model statewide and nationally. He's helped establish similar mentoring programs at 11 colleges and universities in 8 different states, including 3 other UC California campuses. His hard work has not gone unnoticed. In 2013, Barack Obama personally awarded him the Presidential Award for Excellence in Science, Mathematics, and Engineering Mentoring. Those numbers are astounding, but to me, his success in diversity is very personal. Over 20 years ago, I was one of those BSP undergraduates at Cal, and if it weren't for him, I don't think I would be where I am today. As a junior, I found a summer research program opportunity, but it was due in a few days. Now, although the application itself didn't pose a problem for me, it required a letter of recommendation. I was a particularly shy and reserved student with strong imposter syndrome, and so I was racked with anxiety. But thanks to John's genuine concern for his students, I felt comfortable enough to approach him for a letter. He granted my request, but with the caveat, I don't really want to do this with this short a notice, but I'm still going to do it. And as an undergrad, that shook me to my core, and to this day, I've never requested a letter with that short notice. But as a result of John taking this extra effort that day, I attended that summer research program at Columbia University and had a transformational experience working with Patrick Moore, the discoverer of the Kaposi sarcoma virus. And since then, I've been committed to a research career path. It is this extra effort in mentoring that has made John's contributions to diversity so effective to so many generations of young students, which he will share with us today. Please welcome Dr. John Matsui, the 2019 Andy Robertson Memorial Lecturer for the Keystone Symposia.
So the title of the talk, 3 Doors, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. You'll see what this has to do with the Biology Scholars Program, my work over the last 27 years, and with people like Dennis, people with great talent. If only given the right environment, that talent can then be expressed. So I want to say thank you first to the Board of Directors of Keystone, also to the Advisory Board, the Diversity Advisory Committee, Dr. Ricks and her staff, thank you very much, and especially to the students of BSP. They have inspired me, they have taught me. Some people say 27 years, you should know everything there is to know about this work. Well, either I'm a slow learner or there's a lot to learn about this work. The work is not simple work, it's challenging. There are multiple factors that are involved that sometimes facilitate, at other times get in the way of diversifying STEM. So here's how we're going to proceed. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my background in history. Why is an Asian male doing underrepresentation work in STEM? Okay? I mean, model minority. We're supposed to be good at math and science. What is it about my background that really compels me to do this work? I'll share that with you. Second point, why diversity? If it ain't broke, why fix it? Science, STEM in general, is producing great discoveries daily. What's wrong with the way it is? Then I'll talk about the 3 Doors lens, some critical concepts and frameworks to help us understand, to develop a common understanding about the challenge, and also what progress looks like. How do we measure progress? So in terms of my background in history, there's a very special date. Now that isn't my birthday, so don't send me gifts on the 7th of December. What happened on this date? Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor was life-changing for many Japanese Americans. My family on both sides, they were interned. Everything was taken from my families, either stolen or sold for pennies on the dollar. We were put into concentration camps. And this, of course, was before I was born. And as a result, when my parents came back, or my future parents came back to California, I was raised in a very American way. I did not learn to speak Japanese. I did not learn to use chopsticks or hashi until I was in my teens. I disowned, or I was not allowed to own, my culture. And this was something that was very significant to me because I felt the outsider. I didn't know where I belonged. And like many of the students that enter higher education who come from backgrounds where they're the first in their families, I was, when they come from low-income backgrounds. That was my background. Because we had lost everything, we had to start all over again. We don't really know what our place is. Oftentimes we're told to leave our identities, or our identities really aren't of value in the context of higher education. And I was really one of those individuals. And so The phrase professional is personal is something that resonates with some, many, if not all of you in this room. It resonates for me. My personal experiences really have informed my professional work. And as a result, I've actually, besides the Biology Scholars Program, which I'll tell you more about, I've actually served on a number of different panels and national advisory committees. In fact, on June 24th, I'll be at NIH advising Francis Collins and Hannah Valentine about how NIH should be spending its money on student development programs. Some of us have been invited to do that on June 24th. And I feel very honored, but also the responsibility around that. So professional is personal. One of the other things that I've been doing is trying to adapt and scale the Meyerhoff Scholars Program. Some of you in the room know about this. A highly successful program at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County that takes highly qualified, I'm going to put that in quotes, qualified because the students have high SATs and high school GPAs. They come in with the standard metrics of success. And these are underrepresented minority students, and they go on to do PhDs. A wonderful program, and this is one way to do it. HHMI, the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, is also starting a new initiative called the Inclusive Excellence Initiative. And the focus is fixing our institutions and not our students. For 40 years, we've been using programs as the intervention to try and diversify STEM. And now HHMI and NIH is following, and probably NSF, they're following by investing money on institutional change to build the capacity of institutions to provide support for all students, especially those from underrepresented backgrounds in STEM. Back in 1992, a colleague and I started the Biology Scholars Program, and coincidentally, the special issue of Science was about the pipeline issue. And the then editor of Science was just down the hallway from my office, and we would talk often about diversity in STEM. But in his editorial, right at the front, he was talking about the conditions in the US and possibly around the world. But as I remember it, he said, in this country, racism is a thing of the past. Bias is a thing of the past. And anybody with the talent and the hard work can succeed in STEM. In other words, if you don't, it's your problem, because the road is clear. And clearly, we may take issue with that, or maybe not, depending upon where you sit. But this was coincidental. And I took issue at that time and to this day about the representation of the pipeline problem. Students as commodities, all sorts of things that are wrong with that imagery in my mind. So let me tell you about the Biology Scholars Program. The funding currently comes from the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. I've had almost continuous funding for the last 27 years from HHMI, but also Berkeley has skin in the game. It's almost a match between extramural and Berkeley funding. The goal is to enlarge and diversify the pool of students who succeed in biology majors and related careers. Enlarge and diversify, not just skim, in quotes, the top students. So we're enlarging the pool, looking for student talent where maybe nobody else is looking. Members. We've had about 3,600 Berkeley undergraduates participate in the program. At any given time, there are about 400 students in the program. And you can see the demographics of the students, a very different profile than one would expect to be in science, and especially in science at Berkeley. In terms of success, some really common sense metrics. First of all, comparing BSP minority versus non-BSP majority students, my students enter Berkeley with lower SATs and high school GPAs on average, but graduate, as Dennis was talking about, in biology majors in the same percentage as their peers and with equivalent exit GPAs. So in other words, parity. We close the gap with students who are not expected to succeed in science at Berkeley. In 2015, I received the Paceman Award. Some of you may be familiar with that award. It's a Presidential Mentoring Award in STEM. I received the award in 2013, but received the actual presentation of that award in the White House, and here you see all of us in the Oval Office with President Barack Obama. That was an amazing, my voice still quivers because it was such an emotional moment in my life, one which I'll never forget. So what do I mean by diversity? It's a broad definition that goes beyond ethnicity, that goes beyond first to college, that goes beyond gender. Diversity, individuals from backgrounds and identities that at least fit the profile of the historically successful in a discipline, institution, organization, and so on. In other words, who's not at the table historically? I mean, that's what I consider to be diversity. We can talk about that later. But why diversity? I think that's a reasonable question. I pose the question, if it ain't broke, why fix it? Well, there are a number of national reports, white papers that have come out about the need for a more diverse STEM workforce. In fact, the Presidential Council of Advisors on Science and Technology in 2012 said that we're going to fall 1 million STEM workers short in 10 years. And how are we going to meet that need, that workforce need? And the contention in that paper was that the students are already in our classes, already in our labs, and that we just need a different treatment to develop that talent. PCAST also talked about national security. Diversity is really critical to national security. We need diverse minds, individuals from diverse cultures to maintain our national security. But also good science. Oftentimes, diversity and good science aren't viewed as being coincidental or overlapping. And Dr. Hannah Valentine and Dr. Francis Collins at the NIH wrote a great article, I think it was in PNAS, where they actually said we need more research on the connection between good science and diversity. There isn't enough research, enough evidence, enough data, but there is some. And here are some of the studies that have been done around gender diversity and quality of science, gender diversity and the collaborative teamwork process, and also ethnic diversity and impact of the articles that we write. Correlations. But we need more work, and more work is coming. But what about this three doors lens? What am I talking about here? There are three words that we use often, and you hear these all the time. Diversity, equity, inclusion. What exactly do we mean? And here's a very simplistic, and please take issue with me during the Q&A, during the conversation that we have afterwards. Diversity is a number. I can do a count of the diversity in this room. Inclusion, however, is a feeling. You can have a diverse room, but not everybody may feel included. And in fact, equity is how we go, equitable practices, how we go from diversity to inclusion. Very simple, very basic, and we can talk about this. So, these are the three doors, correct? Thank you very much, end of talk. Not exactly. Here are the three doors that I'm thinking of. These three doors. These three bathroom doors in the segregated South. Separate, but not equal. And what does this have to do with what we're doing here today? The question is there still a problem? Today, do the three doors exist in our institutions and in our organizations? Are there equivalent three doors in those things that we belong to? Now, your response is going to depend upon a number of factors. Number one, your background and identity. Okay? We may not all see the situation in the same way. I would imagine there's a diversity of perspective in this room. Secondly, vantage point, which has to do with position, power, and privilege. What role you occupy, the power you have in that role, and the privilege you come from or don't come from. And that also applies within the institution. And your lived experience. Are there still 3 doors? We can talk about that. Here are a couple of examples that came up for me through my students. My students are always helping me better understand the challenge. An African-American male student who was really excited because he had gotten a research stipend, and he was going to do research for the very, very first time. And he was just so excited, he came to me, and then when he went to the lab and he met with the PI said this to him. This is science. Leave your culture at the door. Maybe it was well-intended. There are a lot of assumptions there that science is culture-free, when in fact the PI sets the tone, brings his culture into the laboratory, and so on. But that's not really the point. My point is, my question is, would the PI have said the very same thing had the new student been white or Asian? Probably not. Are there 3 doors? In the classroom, where we have, for most of us, most of our contact with students, and here I'm talking about the undergraduate level. I was at this pedagogy workshop for STEM faculty. And we were sitting around talking about the new student demographic. You know, students are changing. And everybody's going, oh my gosh, they're always on their phones, they're doing this and that. And so the question was, what are you doing? How are you addressing this shift in student demographics? My colleague next to me, who was an engineer, his hand shot up and he said the following: I teach science, I don't teach students. I don't care who's out there. I don't care what their backgrounds are. My job is to teach my discipline in the way that I and other scientists know it. I don't care. Are there 3 doors? How do we talk, listen, and understand across differences that exist in that pedagogy workshop, in this room, when we go back home to our departments, to our companies? How do we talk across those differences? And here's where we have, I went to the literature. I'm an evolutionary biologist by training. I had to go to the intercultural communication literature because I was in a quandary. You know, I was experiencing these sorts of difficult conversations with people, many over the last 27 years. And here's the first thing, that I found. And in fact, this article was written by a friend of mine, and I hadn't gone into the literature. Melanie Tervalon, who got her MD at UCSF, and she and a colleague, a fellow physician, actually wrote this article distinguishing between cultural competency versus cultural humility. Now, in medical training, cultural competency is a big deal, right? Because we want to make sure that our approach to treating our patients is culturally responsive and so on. But they've called this cultural competency. Now, I take issue with this notion of competency. Competency implies or suggests that there's this list of things that if you know that list, you will know about that person. You'll be competent. You'll have mastered it. When in fact, all of you in the room know that the groups, ethnic, socioeconomic, geographic groups to which you belong, there's a great variation within those groups. In fact, there's greater variation within groups than between groups. We know this from evolutionary biology. And so how can you know the entire list? How can you ever be competent? And in fact, when you go in and say, I know the list, therefore I know you, that's pretty insulting, and you don't really feel seen. So the suggestion that Melanie and her colleague put forth was that we need to have cultural humility. That is, we need to acknowledge that we can't know everything about the other. And then, in fact, maybe it's much better to go in like that with that mindset rather than thinking, I know the list, therefore I know you. And here's the second part of the literature that I looked at. I went to communication education to take a look at this notion of empathy versus the third space. And again, now we're talking about talking across differences. And of course, intercultural communications. Empathy is what is typically suggested when we meet with somebody different than ourselves. And what are the phrases? Put yourself in their shoes, right? Walk in their shoes. Empathize. Empathy can only go so far. In fact, for the women in this room, if I said to you, I really know what it's like to be a woman. I really do. Some of my best friends are women. And in fact, I've read some really high-impact articles about what it means to be a woman, and therefore I know. You would feel offended. You would feel like, no way can you really empathize what it's like to be a woman. And so what Broom proposes is this third space notion. And this third space notion is probably what the biology scholars program has been, because we have students from really diverse backgrounds. And not only do students gather in this third space, which I'll explain what it is, but also faculty who are interested from diverse backgrounds, graduate students, postdocs, visiting scholars who have heard about this and for whom this resonates. And what is the third space? A third space is where you have a chance to ask the other questions, where you negotiate meaning, where you don't put yourself in the other's shoes because that is an impossible thing to do, but rather you develop this third space or third culture. And I would say that most of the programs that have worked over the last 40 years are probably this third space. Most of the programs that have worked in terms of diversifying STEM, laboratories that have diverse individuals probably have a good third space component where there are hard and difficult conversations about differences. So think back to your work, think back to your experience, and think back about creating what was created for you that allowed you to better function. And maybe think about what you can create in your circumstances today. But what do we do with what we hear? Framing the challenge. We will hear different sorts of things, but we need to do something with what we hear. And the institutional access frame, I think, is really, really critical. Our institutions, such as this organization, our disciplines, our colleges and universities, institutional access. And here I'm going to borrow from the Americans with Disabilities Act and this notion of universal design. The ADA was brilliant in its construction. The ADA did not list each and every disability that had to be accommodated. Rather, the frame was that our institutions have to be accessible to everybody. Oh my goodness. We don't have to list all the different disabilities. And universal design says you need to keep in mind not just a particular target group, but all groups as you design your institutions. The focus is how can we make our institutions more accessible for all, and how can best practices that work for individuals from marginalized groups, whether they be in chairs, whether they be hearing challenged, whether they be underrepresented in a particular discipline, how can those accommodations, those adaptations, those interventions make our institutions more accessible for us all? And you know this. We benefit from ADA interventions all the time. Curb cuts, right? Curb cuts for people in chairs. Our bicycles, our strollers, sometimes we use curb cuts rather than taking that high step onto the curb, even though we aren't labeled disabled. Electric toothbrushes, right? Those weren't developed for people who had full use of their limbs, but for people with limited mobility in their limbs. But many of us in this room probably use electric toothbrushes. And also closed captions for the hearing challenged, right? If you go to a bar, you will see closed captions. We all benefit from those sorts of interventions. And I think we need to think about the changes that we make in our institutions to broaden access of diverse groups to science, to STEM, to our disciplines, and how that will benefit not just them, but how it will benefit everybody. Change. So, first order change. Let me just go through this really quickly. First order change is about making little tweaks, kind of like moving the deck furniture around to make it look better, okay? And that's not real change. It's a form of change. But for example, let me make this more concrete. The lead in Flint, Michigan drinking water, okay? Everybody knows about this. What was the intervention to address this? Bottled water, okay? They were drinking lead-free water, but everything else stayed the same. That was a first-order change. Let's make this more relevant to what we do at our colleges and universities. Our undervalued students, what do? We make them a program, right? And BSP, and what's going on in Flint, Michigan, BSP is bottled water. UC Berkeley has stayed pretty much the same over the last 27 years. And that's a problem. That's first-order change. Non-lasting change. When my program goes away, if it ever goes away, and the bottled water goes away, then the institution maintains, pretty much status quo. Beware of the bottled water approach. Second-order change is all of this. Significant qualitative changes. Huge shifts in how we view our institutions, and we make these almost irreversible, not quite, depends upon leadership, these shifts in thinking and acting. So if we were to use these two examples, we would change who's elected, we would change the law, we would be hyper-conscious of redlining, right? And for the underprepared, which should be undervalued students in our institutions, we would actually change the way we teach, mentor, and advise, and not have to have special programs for special populations. So we need to ask ourselves, what second-order changes does this organization and other organizations need to make? Second order, not first-order bottled water changes. Frameworks around change, with them. We need to consider reward structures. What's in it for me? Nobody changes without thinking about that. There's got to be a change in the reward structures. In academia, of course, it's the promotion and tenure, career advancement. What's the weight of this work? How much is this simply time away from the bench that gets in the way of science? Is it a burden, or is it something that counts? Picking your battles. You've seen this chart before. Looking at impact and effort, hopefully, well, this is low-hanging fruit, right? High impact, low effort things. But I think the hard work is going to go on right here. High effort, high impact work. And that's where you talk about really dedicating significant amounts of resources and time to get the impact that's desired. What does progress look like? Let me do this. This will be the last slide before I wrap it up, because I want to make sure there's enough time for questions. A fellow by the name of Mark Neve, who's the Chief Diversity Officer in the AAMC, the American Association of Medical Colleges, wrote this article some time ago, and he looked at the state of institutions in terms of dealing with diversity and excellence. He said that some institutions are at this 1.0 level, excellence versus diversity, mutually exclusive sets. And at these institutions, there have been isolated effects to remove social and legal barriers, but in fact, This is a diversity apart. Diversity here, excellence over here. Diversity 2.0 is excellence and diversity in parallel. Diversity and excellence are side by side. But it's still diversity on the periphery. It's diversity on the side. You know, it doesn't really intersect with excellence. But there's some awareness of increasing benefits to all. The aspiration is diversity 3.0. Excellence through diversity, where there's an understanding that diverse minds at the bench, diverse minds in terms of policy making, to ask different questions, diverse questions, and to interpret data from a diverse perspective will lead to excellence. I have a few more slides, but what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to stop right here because I would imagine there are some questions. So thank you very much. Thank you. So Dr. Ricks, how do we do this?
It's Q&A.
Q&A.
Hi, this is Anastasia.
Where?
Over here.
Oh, okay, sorry.
So
This voice came from above.
yeah, I love the diversity 3.0. It makes me think about like the language that we use in my organization, mostly around inclusion.
And your organization is what?
Novartis. And that inclusion and inclusive behaviors are the key to leadership. And so we've been spending a lot of time talking about that. But when we start to get into individual situations, when it's high pressure, fast approaching deadlines, and we start to think about talent, the desire to be inclusive is still there, but the ability to actually push through to actually have inclusive hiring doesn't happen because there's too much pressure and stress. So what would you suggest as a way to help our organizations be more accountable to making sure that they're doing excellence through diversity and inclusion, even when it's really hard and people don't really have time?
So time is an issue. And so our time, how real are the time frames that we have? Maybe there are some factors that could be controlled, okay? That's one aspect. You lengthen the time frame or you start earlier. Maybe that's much more of a proactive thing to lengthen the time frame. The run-up to those sorts of critical decisions, maybe that's one thing. Also, the reward structure. I mean, when we talk about why a project has to happen in a particular time frame, I mean, there's a reward at the end. What are the other rewards for maybe slowing things down and maybe making decisions that will involve maybe a different take on the situation, maybe the outcomes. But this is where the research needs to come in. We don't have the evidence yet. When we talk about productivity, when we talk about science productivity, research productivity, there isn't enough research yet. But I think that some of the research that's being done currently is suggesting that not only is there a higher productivity, but the quality of that productivity benefits from a diverse group of individuals. So I don't have a neat and clean answer for you. But as Collins and Valentine pointed out, we need more evidence to really direct our efforts.
That's very helpful, because as I was thinking about how we're approaching it, we're using more of a punitive system. So if you don't do this, then. Yeah. Versus really thinking about how do we incentivize people to want to do it, and what those things can be in the middle between being super inclusive and not. Yeah.
So these decisions have to be grounded in the reality of the situation, but how much of that reality can be modified, can be tweaked? I mean, this is not the best of all possible worlds, I don't believe, okay, in terms of our work. So I think we need to, we're smart, we're creative. I think we need to direct some of it towards this institutional change.
Can you comment on how leadership and commitment to diversity, how much leadership do you have to really get institutional change?
So I don't want to overgeneralize from my experience, okay? Because I've had some really wonderful upper administrators, and my work has flourished. I've had some challenges also. But one of the things that I know that throughout, whether there was resistance or support, I've had colleagues, I've had my allies, I've had my critical friends to whom I could turn and ask their advice. I'm not directly answering your question, but I would hope for leaders that had a shared vision, but I think it's incumbent upon us to educate our leaders. And not that they're in deficit, but maybe they haven't thought about some of the things in the way we're thinking about those things. Presenting new ideas, possibly shifts in the paradigm that govern their thinking. And so I'm a strong believer in team. I also believe that those who are on the front line can share if given the opportunity. That's why this idea of a third space or a third culture is really important. Because I know, and maybe, you, Anastasia, you were referring to this, but in industry and in academia, we're on fast trains, okay? And so there's very little time to have these difficult conversations and maybe to develop some common understandings that could benefit everybody. Again, that universal design idea. And so I don't think it's a zero-sum game. I don't think that, I'd like to not see winners and losers in this change. Again, I think we're very smart, we're very creative. And so I think we need to put our minds to this, but we also need the help of our social science colleagues. I think that's very, very important. A lot of this work is about, we're doing social science experiments. I also think we need to get our business colleagues involved who have thought deeply about this. Those are my thoughts. And I'm sorry if I haven't, in a simple way, answered your question. But that's how I'm thinking about it.
Okay, well, thank you again, Dr. Matsui.
Thank you.